Why was everyone staring at her like she didn't belong there? That was the question that kept circling through Sarah Morgan's head as the late afternoon light poured across the gym floor at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The place felt like a furnace. Sweat, salt, and rubber mats mixed in the air, the kind of smell that clung to skin and memory. Outside, the Pacific winds tried to break through the heat, but inside, the air hung thick with tension. It was 3:15 p.m., the last stretch of the day, when tempers ran short and the body's strength was tested more by exhaustion than by weight. Rows of young sailors stood in loose formation on the blue mats, some eager, some nervous, and in the center of it all stood Lieutenant Ethan Davis. His voice carried the confidence of a man who believed control was his birthright, sharp, cold. He moved across the gym floor like he owned it because in his mind he did. His uniform was crisp, every button aligned, every motion deliberate. The kind of man who smiled not to reassure, but to remind you he was in charge. He told them this was his mat, his rules. That out here, quotas and politics didn't matter. That what decided survival was aggression, not patience, power, not restraint. The sailors nodded, some out of belief, most out of fear. But when his gaze landed on her, the only woman in the group, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah Morgan didn't flinch, didn't shrink, didn't even blink. She just stood there, calm, balanced. Her shoulders relaxed, her stance quiet but deliberate, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. Her breathing didn't falter, her eyes stayed forward. And somehow, her silence spoke louder than any defense could. Lieutenant Davis took a step closer. His boots squeaked against the mat. That sound, that slow, dragging rhythm, felt like the prelude to something everyone could feel coming, but no one wanted to see. He started circling her, voice dripping with arrogance. "Combat isn't about hesitation, it's about dominance," he said. "And out here size does matter, biology doesn't lie." A few forced chuckles echoed across the gym, nervous, weak. Morgan didn't move. Fleet Master Chief Raymond Thorne watched from the doorway. Old, weathered, sharp eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by human pride. He served 30 years, enough to recognize the subtle tension in a person's stance. He saw how her balance never shifted, how her breathing never broke, and how stillness came to her like muscle memory. He didn't interrupt, he didn't need to. Because what was about to happen, he'd seen it before. And he knew the young lieutenant was about to learn something no manual could ever teach. Davis clapped his hands once. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. He said it was time for a demonstration. The sailors shuffled closer, the floor squeaking beneath their boots. Morgan's eyes flicked once toward the open bay doors, sunlight cutting through the haze, then back to the lieutenant. There was no fear, only patience. Davis gestured for her to step forward. "Let's show them how it's done," he said. The silence in the gym deepened. It wasn't just quiet, it was watchful. Morgan stepped onto the mat. The faint shift of her weight was the only sound. Davis smiled, that kind of smile that isn't joy but performance. He wanted to make a point. He wanted to prove something. And the worst thing a man like that can face is a woman who refuses to give him the reaction he expects. He reached for her wrist, his hand strong and deliberate, too strong. This wasn't how a training grip was supposed to feel. It was tighter, personal. He explained to the others about leverage, about strength, about physics. His words were lessons, but they were aimed like weapons. He twisted her wrist slightly, pulling her shoulder forward, using her as an example. "You see," he said, "smaller frame, lower output, that's just reality." A few uneasy laughs followed. Thorne didn't move. Morgan didn't blink. She just absorbed the force, adjusted her stance. Quiet correction only a trained operator would notice. Her balance stayed perfect. Davis kept talking, louder now. Out there when the rifle jams or the knife slips, muscle decides who goes home. He said it like a sermon, as if strength came from volume. But Sarah had learned a different kind of strength, the kind that didn't raise its voice. He shoved her shoulder back, harder this time. Her boot slid half an inch, nothing more. Around them, the sailors began to exchange uncertain glances. The silence started to feel wrong. Davis didn't stop. He was chasing validation, not instruction. And everyone could feel it. He raised his hand slightly, faking a strike, once then again closer this time. And that was when the room shifted. It wasn't just about demonstration anymore. It was about ego. "You can't hold back," he barked. Then he stopped pretending. The slap came fast. A flat, sharp sound that tore through the air, the kind of sound that doesn't echo just once. The room froze. Nobody breathed. Sarah's head turned slightly from the impact. Her hair shifted across her cheek. But her feet never moved. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that burns. Davis's hand stayed in the air, as if his body hadn't caught up to his mistake. The laughter was gone. The air dead still. Thorne didn't move. Not yet. Sarah turned her eyes toward the lieutenant. Calm, measured, steady. And for a moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just that, two people standing in the heat, surrounded by witnesses who didn't know what they were witnessing yet. She inhaled slowly. It wasn't rage. It wasn't shock. It was focus. And then she moved. It happened faster than thought. A blur of motion so clean it barely looked real. She twisted her wrist inward, snapping free of his grip. The weak point, the base of his thumb, folded instantly. Before his mind registered pain, her open palm struck the side of his neck, the brachial plexus nerve cluster, and his dominant arm went limp. He gasped, his body folded. The sailors didn't even have time to blink. She pivoted, turned her hip, redirected his momentum, and the next second, his body hit the mat with a solid, final thud. Silence again. She was already kneeling, one knee on his chest, forearm across his throat, not to choke, just to control. It was perfect form. Controlled, restrained. Professional. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe less. When it was over, Davis's eyes were wide, not from pain but from disbelief. Because in that moment, every ounce of authority he'd wrapped himself in was gone. Morgan looked down at him. No anger, no pride, no satisfaction. Just stillness. Her breathing never changed. The sailors stood frozen, as if even their minds were trying to catch up to what had happened. Fleet Master Chief Thorne stepped forward. His boots echoed on the mat, slow, deliberate. He stopped beside them, looking down at the lieutenant. Then at her. "Petty officer," he said quietly, "on your feet." Her hand released immediately. She stood at attention, posture flawless. Davis stayed down. His pride had taken the harder hit. The room didn't move. The silence was heavy, almost reverent. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't defiance. It was mastery. And as Thorne's gaze swept across the circle of sailors, he knew this moment would not stay contained inside this gym. It would spread, whispered at first, then remembered. Because lessons like this don't fade. They settle deep. Sarah Morgan stood there, quiet, unshaken, while everyone else tried to find their breath again. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply existed in stillness. And in that silence, something in the hierarchy of that base shifted forever. Nobody moved. The air inside the Coronado gym still carried the ghost of that slap, a sound that refused to fade. It clung to the metal rafters, to the walls, to the backs of the sailors' throats, Lieutenant Ethan Davis lay flat on the mat, staring up at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling in shallow, broken rhythm. The smell of sweat and rubber was still there, but now it mixed with something else, the faint, metallic taste of shame. Fleet Master Chief Raymond Thorne stood above him, unmoving. For a long time no one spoke. Even the overhead fans seemed to hush. Then quietly, Thorne said two words that cut through the stillness like a bell. "Hold position." Every sailor froze. No one dared shift or whisper. Thorne's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried weight, the kind of authority that didn't come from rank anymore, but from something deeper. He motioned to his aide, a young petty officer standing at the far end of the room, stiff as a statue. The man moved quickly, bringing forward a matte black Navy-issued tablet, its casing scratched from years of use. Thorne took it without a word. The screen lit up, throwing a faint blue light across his face. He pressed his thumb to the biometric reader. A soft beep broke the silence. Then the retinal scan. Another tone. Everyone watched. No one knew what was happening, but every sailor could feel the gravity of it. When Thorne finally spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, the kind of tone reserved for things that could not be undone. He began to read. Name: Sarah Morgan. Rank: Special Warfare Operator First Class. The words hung in the air. A few heads lifted in confusion. Thorne continued. Unit: Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Red Squadron. The silence cracked open. A few sailors exhaled sharply, eyes widening. One of them mouthed the words Dev Gru, SEAL Team 6. For a heartbeat, even the air stopped moving. Lieutenant Davis blinked. The color drained from his face. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Thorne kept reading. Multiple commendations for valor. Master Breacher. Advanced Close Quarters Combat Instructor. Tier 1 Operator. Each word fell heavier than the last. The sailors looked at Morgan now with something between awe and disbelief. A few of them straightened instinctively, as though their bodies knew they were standing in the presence of someone far beyond what they'd assumed. Thorne lowered the tablet slowly, his gaze never leaving Davis. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. The weight in his silence said everything. Then in that same calm, quiet tone he spoke. Leadership, he said, isn't measured by how loud you speak or by how hard you hit. His words echoed softly in the still gym. Strength, he continued, isn't about proving dominance. It's about knowing when not to use it. The young sailors watched wide-eyed, as Thorne turned toward them, not as a superior but as a teacher. He gestured toward Morgan. That, he said, is what restraint looks like. That's what professionalism is. You don't test it, you learn from it. The sailors didn't breathe. Lieutenant Davis stared at the floor now. His hands trembled faintly. His uniform, once immaculate, looked disordered, a small crease here, a shift there. But the real damage wasn't on the outside. It was internal. Pride stripped bare. He looked up at her once, just once. There was no anger in her eyes, no satisfaction, only something harder to face: composure. And that somehow was worse. Thorne took a slow step forward until he stood between them. His boots echoed softly, a single, rhythmic sound that filled the silence with authority. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at Davis, not as an officer, not as an enemy, but as a man who had crossed a line and realized it too late. Then Thorne turned to Morgan. And what he did next, no one in that room would ever forget. The Fleet Master Chief, the highest enlisted man on the base, a legend whose name carried more weight than most officers' careers, straightened his posture, lifted his hand and saluted her. It was sharp, crisp, precise. The sound of that single motion cut through the air like thunder. A senior chief saluting a petty officer in front of officers and sailors alike. It broke every expectation of hierarchy. But in that moment, it wasn't about rank. It was about respect. Sarah didn't return it immediately. She stood still, her expression calm, unreadable, her jaw still faintly red from where Davis's hand had struck. The silence deepened. Every sailor stood straighter. Even the fans above seemed to still their hum. And then slowly, deliberately, she returned the salute. It was small, quiet, but it carried the kind of gravity no speech could ever match. For a heartbeat, time seemed to pause. Thorne lowered his hand. No one spoke. There were no words for what had just happened, because everyone there understood instinctively that they had just witnessed something sacred. Something that went beyond training, beyond discipline, beyond gender or authority. It was the kind of lesson that doesn't need to be written down, because it's burned into memory. Thorne's voice broke the silence. "Dismissed," he said softly. But the word didn't break the reverence. It just gave people permission to breathe again. The sailors began to move slowly, quietly, not like before. Their boots no longer shuffled carelessly. Every step was measured, respectful. Davis stayed on the mat a while longer. When he finally stood, he didn't meet anyone's eyes. Morgan had already turned away. She wasn't looking for vindication. She didn't need it. Her dignity didn't demand an audience. Thorne watched her as she walked toward the far end of the gym, sunlight cutting across her frame. Her shadow stretched across the blue mat, long, steady, unbroken. There was a kind of poetry in that moment, something unspoken but deeply felt. A lesson passed from silence to silence. In the Navy, there are stories that get told in bars and briefings, the kind that fade after a few weeks. And then there are the ones that carve themselves into the culture. This one would be the latter. By the next morning, whispers had already started. Not gossip, reverence. They said a lieutenant had crossed a line, and a petty officer had taught him what control really meant. The name spread quickly. Morgan Davis Thorne. 3 names, 1 lesson. And every version of the story began with the same moment, that sound. That slap. And the silence that followed it. Outside, the sun dipped low over the Pacific. The air smelled of salt and jet fuel, the familiar scent of the base at dusk. Sarah stood alone near the edge of the tarmac, eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind tugged at her hair, soft strands moving across her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. Her jaw still ached faintly, but she didn't touch it. Pain was just information. It didn't deserve attention. She exhaled slowly, feeling the heat of the day leaving her body. Somewhere behind her, the door of the gym opened. Heavy footsteps, steady, deliberate, approached. It was Thorne. He stopped beside her, hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, "You didn't have to do what you did." She looked straight ahead. He didn't have to do what he did either. Thorne nodded once, fair. The silence returned, the kind of silence that carries respect, not tension. After a while, Thorne added, "You know this will spread, people talk." "They always do," she said softly. "It doesn't matter." "It might," he replied. "Stories have a way of growing." Sarah turned slightly toward him, then let it grow the right way. He studied her profile, calm, unreadable, steady as the sea itself. "You ever regret being underestimated?" he asked. She smiled faintly, the first real expression since the gym. "Every time, but only for them, not for me." Thorne's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. He nodded again, then started to walk away. "Good work today," he said over his shoulder, even if it wasn't meant to be. She didn't answer, she didn't need to. The sound of his boots faded down the concrete, leaving only the hum of distant engines and the cry of gulls over the bay. Sarah stayed there a little longer, the Pacific breeze brushing across her skin. She wasn't thinking about Davis or Thorne or the sailors who'd watched. She was thinking about how quickly arrogance can become a teacher. and how silence, when held long enough, becomes strength. As the sun sank into the horizon, its reflection painted the surface of the water gold and red. She turned toward the barracks, her silhouette moving through the fading light. And behind her, the gym stood still, quiet now, but forever changed. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. No one knew who told the story first. Maybe it was one of the new recruits who couldn't hold it in. Maybe it was a petty officer whispering over dinner in the mess hall. Or maybe, as some later said, stories like this never really start. They're just born the moment truth becomes too powerful to hide. By sunrise, everyone at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado had heard some version of what happened in the gym. The story moved like heat through steel, quiet, invisible, unstoppable. They said a lieutenant had raised his hand against a woman. They said that woman had been calm, patient, silent. And that when he struck her, the silence struck back. Every retelling twisted the details. Some claimed she'd moved faster than sight, others that she hadn't moved at all. Some said Thorne shouted, others swore he never raised his voice. But in every version, every single one, there was a moment of stillness. A pause. A silence so heavy it became sacred. By noon, sailors walking the corridors of the training facility would stop talking when she passed. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Sarah Morgan didn't notice at first, or maybe she did but chose not to. She walked the same halls, trained at the same hours, ate in the same mess, quietly, methodically, without deviation. Her routine was her anchor. It had always been. She didn't smile when people whispered, didn't respond when they stared. She didn't want to be anyone's symbol. But that was the thing about symbols. You don't get to choose when you become one. In the gym where it happened, the blue mats had been scrubbed clean. But someone, no one knew who, drew a small black star right where Davis's head had hit the floor. Permanent marker. Small, unremarkable at first glance. The mark bled into the rubber, the ink spreading faintly through the fibers like an old wound. At first, it was just a mark. Then it became something else. Sailors started calling it the Morgan Mark. A reminder, they said, that arrogance could fall faster than pride could stand. New recruits would whisper about it before class. Instructors would glance at it during drills, not to worship, but to remember. Thorne noticed it one morning while walking through the gym. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment, staring at that small, uneven star. Then he turned and left. Sometimes silence is approval. That week, Lieutenant Ethan Davis's name quietly disappeared from the command roster. The official notice read, reassigned to Pentagon operations, effective Monday, 7:30. Those who'd been there knew better. It wasn't reassignment. It was exile. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. In the Navy, punishment doesn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes it comes with a desk and a locked door. Sarah never asked where he went. She didn't need to. For her, that moment in the gym wasn't about revenge. It was about something simpler. Balance restored. Order returned. But even she couldn't stop the way it grew. Stories once born have a will of their own. In the barracks, sailors would lean over bunks and whisper. She didn't even blink. She didn't hit him out of anger. She just reminded him who she was. And someone always added, Fleet Master Chief Thorne saluted her. That detail never changed. It became legend by the end of the month. People from other bases would mention it over beers, lowering their voices like it was classified. Some believed it. Some didn't. But those who'd been there never argued. They knew. And in quiet corners of the Navy, a strange thing began to happen. Officers started to pause before speaking down to their enlisted. Instructors began to emphasize control over dominance, and recruits, especially the women, began to walk a little taller. Not because someone told them to, but because they'd heard the story. And stories change posture. Sarah Morgan didn't see any of it. Or maybe she refused to. Every morning she was up before dawn, lacing her boots in the half-dark, the air thick with ocean mist. She'd step out onto the training field, the world still blue with early light, and start her run. 3 miles before sunrise. 5 if she needed to think. Her thoughts never lingered on that day in the gym. She had learned long ago that reflection could be as dangerous as hesitation. But sometimes in the last stretch of her run, when her lungs burned and her heartbeat thundered in her ears, the memory came back. Not the slap, not the throw, not the silence, the look on his face. That split second when realization hit, not that she was stronger, but that she had always been. She never hated him for it. Pity maybe, but not hate. She'd seen worse men break under less pressure. Ego is fragile. And in the military, fragility hides well behind command bars. She finished her run as the sun broke the horizon. Sweat rolled down her temples. The world glowed gold and salt and fire. Somewhere behind her, the bass loudspeakers blared the first notes of morning call. Another day. Another routine. Another silence she'd learned to keep. Later that afternoon, she stood in the same gym, leading physical training for the next rotation of recruits. The blue mats had been replaced, but the black star, redrawn by someone's hand, remained exactly where it had been. The recruits stood around it, restless, uncertain. They had all heard. None dared mention it. She could see it in their posture, the way they avoided that spot, as if stepping over it would mean crossing into the story itself. Sarah looked at them quietly. She didn't mention the mark, didn't acknowledge the whispers. Instead, she said one thing. Control, she told them, isn't about holding back. It's about knowing when not to move. No one spoke. She began the drills. Every motion was measured, every word precise. No noise, no pride, just discipline. Fleet Master Chief Thorne passed by the door halfway through. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded once, a subtle gesture between professionals who understood each other. When the class ended, the recruits left quietly, one by one. Sarah stayed behind, sitting on the edge of the mat, staring at the faint black star. It wasn't about that day anymore. It wasn't even about her. It was about what people learned when silence teaches the lesson words never could. She exhaled slow. The kind of breath that comes when you've carried something too long and decide, finally, to set it down. Outside, gulls screamed over the waves. Somewhere on the tarmac, engines roared to life. The base moved on. But the story stayed. That night, a sailor in the barracks retold it again, voice low, eyes wide. And this time someone asked, did she ever say anything after it happened? The storyteller shook his head. No, he said, she didn't have to. The following week, a new batch of recruits arrived. They gathered in the same gym, wide-eyed and sweating under the California heat. The instructor, a senior chief with a voice rough from years at sea, pointed to the floor. You see that mark? He asked. Heads turned. That's the Morgan mark, he said, and if you're smart, you'll never forget what it means. Someone asked, what does it mean, Chief? The instructor's eyes softened. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said quietly, it means strength doesn't have to shout. And for a long moment, nobody spoke. The sound of the surf rolled faintly through the open bay doors. The wind carried the scent of the ocean, sharp, cold, endless. And there, on that blue mat, one small black star glistened faintly under the light. Worn, imperfect. but still indelible. It started small, as all things that last often do. A rumor whispered over coffee. A retelling during watch duty. A story passed between bases like contraband truth. By the time the sun rose over the Atlantic 3 months later, the story of the Morgan Mark had already crossed oceans. Nobody knew how. Nobody tried to stop it. It had a pulse of its own now, slow, steady, unstoppable. In Norfolk, a petty officer told it during a leadership seminar. In Pearl Harbor, a senior chief quoted it during a safety brief. In Guam, a lieutenant commander mentioned it in passing and then went silent halfway through, as if the weight of it hit mid-sentence. Every version changed slightly. Some said she'd been special forces. Others claimed she'd been an instructor from the start. A few added details, that she'd broken his wrist, that she'd been promoted the next day. None of that was true. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the core, the moment when silence stood taller than authority. Sarah Morgan never asked for any of it. In truth, she tried to bury it. She kept her head down, filed her reports, led her drills. Every morning at dawn, she was still there, running along the shoreline before the base woke. The ocean air sharp, her breath visible in the cold. Each stride was an exhale of control. Each mile, a way to remind herself she was still just a sailor. But the story followed her like a shadow. She began to notice how conversations stopped when she entered a room. How officers softened their tone. How sailors she didn't recognize would straighten their posture just a little more when she passed. Respect she could handle. But reverence, that was harder. Because reverence builds walls, and she had spent her entire life breaking through them. One afternoon, weeks after the incident, she found herself standing outside Thorne's office. He'd called her in not for reprimand, not for praise, just to talk. Inside, the old chief sat behind a desk cluttered with files and black coffee that smelled like seawater and sleep deprivation. He didn't look up right away, just kept reading, glasses perched low on his nose. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured. "You know they're calling it the Mark now." She nodded once. "I've heard." Thorne leaned back, studying her. "You okay with that?" She hesitated. "It's not about being okay, Chief, it's just unnecessary." "Unnecessary," he echoed, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't do it for attention. I did it because it was wrong." Thorne smiled faintly, a slow, weary expression. "That's exactly why it stuck." She didn't respond. He sighed, setting down the file. "You'll transfer soon. Dam Neck Annex, SEAL development, they could use someone like you." She looked at him, eyes steady. "That's not a request, is it?" He chuckled. "No, it's not." Silence. Then softer, he added, "They'll tell the story there too. Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Sarah looked down, fingers tracing the edge of the desk. "Stories change things, Chief. Sometimes the wrong way." Thorne nodded slowly. "Then make sure this one changes things right." Their eyes met for a moment, understanding, wordless, complete. When she walked out of his office, the wind outside smelled of jet fuel and salt. The sun had begun to set behind the barracks, painting the sky in orange streaks. And for the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. Not because the story was over, but because she finally accepted it never would be. Dam Neck Annex, Virginia. 6 months later. The morning air was colder here. The Atlantic was grayer, rougher, less forgiving. It matched her mood, calm but restless underneath. The facility looked different. The walls bore no memory of Coronado. New voices, new hierarchy, new expectations. But the silence, that same old silence, followed her in. Her new students didn't know her personally, but they knew her story. You could see it in the way they looked at her, with a mix of curiosity and quiet awe. A legend teaching them to fight. A myth made flesh. She hated that thought. So she stripped the myth down in the only way she knew how, by outworking every story ever told about her. She led dawn runs through fog so thick it swallowed headlights. She drilled them until their hands blistered and their arms trembled. She taught them not just how to fight, but when not to. And when she spoke, it was never loud. Her voice was calm, controlled, precise. You don't rise to the occasion, she'd tell them. You fall to your level of training. They listened not because she was feared, but because every word she said carried proof. Some of the younger operators tried to impress her. They'd push harder, lift more, run farther. But Sarah never rewarded bravado. She rewarded balance. During close-quarters drills, she'd pause behind one of them, hands folded, watching silently. The trainee would strike the dummy too hard, overcommitted, off-center. She'd step forward, reposition their stance by an inch, and whisper, "Control your breathing. You're not fighting the target, you're fighting yourself." Those who listened learned. Those who didn't last. At night, when the base went quiet and the floodlights buzzed softly over the fields, she'd sometimes sit alone outside the hangar. The cold bit at her skin, the Atlantic wind howled. She'd watch the horizon, that endless line where the sea met sky, and think about Coronado. About the gym, the slap, the silence that followed. She could still hear the echo sometimes, faint but real, like it was carved into her bones. And she'd wonder if Davis ever thought about it too. If he ever replayed that moment in his head, the point where arrogance met consequence. She didn't hate him. Not anymore. He was just part of the lesson, the living proof that strength without humility is just noise. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and let the memory play, not for ego, not for pride, but to remind herself of who she refused to become. And in those quiet, cold nights, she'd think of Thorne. The salute. The words he never said, but didn't need to. There was something sacred in that gesture. Something eternal. She carried it with her, not as a badge but as a burden. Because reverence is a heavy thing to hold when you never asked for it. The story of the Morgan mark kept spreading. Across units, across ships, across generations of sailors who would never meet her but still quote her lessons. Instructors began adding it to their briefings. They'd point to the floor and say, "Arrogance breaks faster than bone." Young recruits would whisper about her, "The woman who didn't flinch. The SEAL who taught silence to speak." And somewhere, in some base gym thousands of miles away, someone would redraw that black star on a new mat. A quiet act of respect. A small rebellion against pride. The Navy had changed, not by policy, not by orders, but by one moment of clarity, 1 second of stillness that rippled outward like soundless thunder. Sarah Morgan never told her side of the story. Not once. Not to the press, not to command, not even to her closest peers. Because for her, that moment wasn't a myth. It was just a reminder that real strength doesn't need to prove itself. It just stands. And sometimes it strikes back, not out of anger but out of necessity. She sat there one night, watching the ocean crash against the shore, her reflection faint in the hangar glass. A quiet smile crossed her face, the kind that doesn't reach the lips but rests somewhere deeper. She thought of the recruits who would train here after she was gone. Of the black stars drawn and redrawn across the Navy, fading, replaced, but never erased. Maybe that was the point. Maybe legends weren't meant to be remembered. Maybe they were meant to remind. The wind howled louder now. The floodlights flickered. Somewhere in the dark, a ship's horn moaned across the bay. Sarah Morgan stood, pulled her jacket tighter and turned toward the barracks. Tomorrow would come early. The sea didn't care about legends. It only cared about discipline. And she still had work to do. He reminded her of someone she tried hard to forget. The arrogance, the grin that came too easily, the way he filled silence with noise, like quiet itself was an enemy to be conquered. His name was Jason Rourke. 24. Strong, fast, brilliant even when he wanted to be. But he had the one flaw that broke most soldiers long before the battlefield ever could. He needed to be seen. The first time Sarah Morgan met him, he was in the mat room, same rubber smell, same echo of boots, same restless heat she'd known years ago. The faces were new, the walls cleaner, but the pattern was the same. She stood at the edge of the room, clipboard in hand, silent as always. Rourke was sparring with another trainee, a smaller man, lighter, cautious, precise. Rourke had him pinned within seconds, muscles straining, a smile on his face. When the bell rang, he didn't let go immediately. He waited just long enough for dominance to feel like victory. The others clapped half-heartedly. Morgan didn't move. Later, as the class dispersed, she called out softly, "Rourke." He turned, sweat dripping down his temple, the grin still there. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him. "What did you learn from that match?" He shrugged. "That strength wins." Her gaze didn't waver. "Does it?" Rourke frowned slightly. "Didn't it?" Morgan's voice stayed calm, almost disarmingly quiet. "Your opponent wasn't weaker. He was measured. You mistook that for submission. That's not strength, Rourke. That's insecurity." The grin faded, just a flicker, but she saw it. He nodded quickly, like the words hadn't hit. "Understood, ma'am." But she knew better. He didn't understand. Not yet. That night, as she reviewed performance notes in her office, she caught herself staring at his file longer than she meant to. His record was near perfect, top 3% in every category, but beside his name, a handwritten note from another instructor stood out. Potential leader, overconfident, doesn't listen well. She exhaled slowly. That was the line she'd seen too many times before. Different name, same story. A memory surfaced, the sound of a slap echoing in a hot gym in Coronado. The silence after. The weight that never quite left her shoulders. She closed the file. Some lessons, she thought, can't be taught with words. The next morning, the fog rolled in heavy off the Atlantic. The bass felt muted, the kind of quiet that makes every footstep sound louder than it should. Sarah walked into the training hall before sunrise. Rourke was already there, hitting the punching bag with a rhythm that spoke more of frustration than focus. She watched for a moment. He didn't notice her until she spoke. "Early start." He spun around. "Yes, ma'am, just keeping sharp." She walked closer, her voice calm. "You're hitting too hard." He frowned. "Isn't that the point?" "No," she said softly. "Control is the point. Anyone can throw a punch. Professionals end a fight before it begins." Rourke smirked. "With respect, ma'am, that sounds like something people say when they can't hit as hard." The silence after that sentence could have frozen air. Sarah looked at him, really looked. The way Thorne once looked at her, not angry, just measuring what kind of man he was going to become. She stepped forward, standing barely a foot away. "Let's test that theory," she said quietly. The smirk faltered, then returned. "You want to spar?" "No," she said. "You want to prove something. I just want to show you the cost." He hesitated, then nodded. They stepped onto the mat. For a moment, it was just breathing. Two soldiers, two generations, two different definitions of strength. He lunged first, fast, aggressive, overcommitted. She sidestepped. No block, no counter, just moved. He turned, struck again, harder this time. She let his momentum carry him past. He stumbled. "Slow down," she said. He ignored it. The third strike came higher, wild with pride. This time she caught his wrist midair, twisted slightly and stepped inward. The motion was effortless, the same one she once used on Davis. 2 seconds later, Rourke was face down on the mat, breath caught, pain radiating through his arm. She didn't press, didn't gloat. Just held him there. "Strength doesn't need to announce itself," she said softly. "It just needs to exist when called." Then she released him, stepping back. He lay there a moment, staring at the floor, realization dawning slow and heavy. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed. The arrogance was gone. In its place, silence. After that morning, something shifted in him. He trained differently. He spoke less. He started watching her more closely. The way she moved, the way she taught, the way she commanded without ever raising her voice. One day, during rifle drills, he approached her between sets. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "may I ask you something?" She nodded. "Is it true what they say about Coronado?" Her hand stilled. She turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing not in anger but thought. "What do they say?" "That you took down a lieutenant, that Fleet Master Chief Thorne saluted you." She said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, "They remember the wrong part." "What do you mean?" "It wasn't about the fight," she said. "It was about restraint." Rourke nodded, but his face showed he didn't fully understand. He was young, understanding takes time. She looked out across the range, the sound of gunfire echoing in the distance. "You can't control the story people tell," she said softly, "but you can control what they learn from it." Weeks passed. Winter came. The cold bit through the Virginia air, sharp and wet. Rourke improved faster than anyone expected. He was disciplined now, still intense but quieter. He'd learned to channel energy instead of releasing it. And Sarah, she saw something in him, something she hadn't expected. Reflection. He reminded her of what she'd once been before the silence taught her who she really was. Every generation, she thought, needs someone to remind them that humility isn't weakness. It's the foundation of every victory that matters. One afternoon, near the end of the training cycle, the commanding officer of the program called her into his office. He was an old-school officer, direct, efficient, and more pragmatic than poetic. He gestured toward a seat. "Sarah," he said, "your trainee Rourke, he's ready for field assignment. You've done good work with him." She nodded. "He's earned it." The commander leaned back. "He asked to stay under your instruction for another quarter. That's rare." She looked up surprised. "He did." He nodded. "Says you changed how he sees strength." Sarah smiled faintly. "I didn't, the Navy did, I just pointed." The commander chuckled. "You always this humble." She shrugged lightly. "No, just tired of noise." He nodded, understanding. "Then keep doing what you're doing. Whatever it is, it's working." That night after lights out, she stood alone on the empty mat. The room was dim, lit only by the low hum of ceiling lamps. Somewhere above her, the wind howled against the hangar roof. She looked down at the blue mat, clean, polished, no marks this time. Still, she could almost see it. That small black star. The one that had followed her everywhere. Not painted anymore. Just carried inside her now. She knelt for a moment, fingertips brushing the smooth surface. And in that silence, she thought about all the years since Coronado. The people she'd trained. The ones who listened. The ones who didn't. The ones who learned too late. She wondered if that was what legacy really meant, not medals or names carved into plaques, but quiet shifts in behavior that ripple outward, unseen, unstoppable. Her reflection in the polished mat looked older than she felt. Not tired, just seasoned. She smiled faintly. Sometimes, she thought, we spend our lives trying not to become the stories they tell about us. But sometimes, Maybe that's how we serve best. The door opened behind her. Rourke stepped in, still in training gear, sweat drying on his neck. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I just wanted to thank you." She turned. "For what?" "For teaching me that silence isn't weakness." She studied him, the same way Thorne had once studied her. Then she nodded. "You'll teach someone else that someday," she said softly. "That's how this works." He smiled, saluted sharply, then turned to leave. As the door closed, she whispered under her breath, words she hadn't said aloud in years. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." Her voice barely reached the walls, but in that quiet room it echoed like thunder. The sea was black that night, the kind of black that swallows sound and light, and everything in between. Jason Rourke sat inside the cargo bay of a V-22 Osprey, the hum of its rotors shaking through his bones. He'd been on countless flights before, but this one felt different. Quieter. He wasn't thinking about the mission brief or the objective points. He was thinking about a voice, calm, precise, measured, telling him, control isn't about holding back. It's about knowing when not to move. He had laughed when she said it. He wasn't laughing now. The aircraft cut through the night, wind screaming across its frame. Beside him, 6 operators sat strapped in, eyes hidden behind night vision lenses, weapons resting on their knees. They were headed toward a small island off the Horn of Africa, a target extraction gone bad. A surveillance team had gone dark. 2 operators missing. 1 confirmed wounded. It was supposed to be simple. It never was. The pilot's voice crackled through the comms. 2 minutes to drop. Rourke nodded to himself. Heartbeat steady. Breath slow. Exactly like she taught him. He wasn't the loudest one anymore. He wasn't the first to move, or the one to rush the line. He'd learned the hardest lesson the easy way, through silence. As the ramp opened, cold air punched through the cabin. The world outside was a storm of wind and salt and shadow. Rourke stood, checked his harness, and stepped into the night. The operation was fast. Too fast. Landing zone secure. Movement in the tree line. Then chaos. Gunfire cracked through the dark, not the cinematic kind, but the ugly, chaotic kind that comes in bursts, ricochets, and half-formed shouts. Rourke moved low, scanning, breathing through the panic. He remembered her words, "Slow down. Let your mind catch up before your hands do." He spotted one of the missing operators behind a collapsed wall, bleeding badly. He sprinted, sliding into cover beside him. "Status," he called out. "Leg gone," the man gasped. "Radio's dead." Rourke's heartbeat didn't spike. Not anymore. He patched the wound, pressed the tourniquet, scanned the perimeter. Bullets hit dirt nearby. He ignored them. "Stay with me," he said quietly. "We're leaving." The man shook his head. "Go, you'll get pinned." Rourke smiled faintly. "She'd kill me if I did." The man didn't understand. But the words made Rourke move faster. He carried him step by step, through smoke and dirt and shouting. Each breath hurt. Each step burned. But there was clarity in it. A strange, perfect clarity that comes when training and purpose merge into one. He wasn't thinking about orders anymore. He was thinking about silence, and the woman who taught him how to live inside it. They reached extraction as dawn cracked open the horizon, pale gold bleeding into black. The helicopter touched down. The roar drowned everything else. Rourke pushed the wounded operator up the ramp, shouting something that no one heard. When the Osprey lifted, dust spiraled beneath them, a halo of noise and chaos, but Rourke stood still, breathing slow. For the first time in his life, stillness felt stronger than movement. Weeks later, back at Dam Neck, Sarah Morgan sat at her desk when the after-action report came in. She read it slowly, eyes tracing each line with quiet pride. No casualties. Objective secured. 2 operators saved. The final line caught her eye. Lead operator displayed exceptional restraint under fire, maintained composure beyond standard expectation. At the bottom, handwritten in pen, a note from the mission commander. He credited his instructor, said she taught him how not to move. She stared at the page for a long time. Then she leaned back, exhaling deeply. For a moment, the years fell away. She was back in Coronado, the heat, the sound of that slap, the stillness that followed. All the things that made her who she was, and now, who someone else was becoming. It wasn't about pride. It was about continuation. Because maybe that's what real strength is. Not legacy written in medals or stars, but in the quiet, unseen echo of someone doing the right thing when no one's watching. She closed the file. The sound was soft, final. That evening she walked down to the docks. The sun hung low, bleeding red across the Atlantic. Waves crashed against the concrete, rhythm steady as a heartbeat. She stood there for a long time, the ocean breeze tugging at her hair. A few yards away, 2 young sailors were talking, their voices low but clear. "They say the mark started everything," one said. "You know the story about the seal who?" The other cut him off. "Yeah, I've heard it, she's a legend." Sarah smiled faintly, unseen. Legends. People loved them because legends were safe, clean versions of messy truths. But what happened that day in Coronado wasn't clean. It was raw, human, painful, and necessary. She looked down at her reflection in the water. Older now. Lines deeper. Eyes the same. She whispered to herself, legends fade, standards don't. A gull cried overhead, cutting through the wind. She looked up, squinting at the horizon. Somewhere out there, Rourke was flying home. Alive. Changed. And she realized that was her victory. Not the mark. Not the myth. But the quiet continuation of discipline passed through generations, unspoken but lived. That was enough. She turned back toward the base, the sound of the waves following her footsteps. Somewhere a bell rang in the distance, signaling shift change. The world kept moving, as it always did. But the echo of that story, her story, was still there. Not loud. Not proud. Just steady. Later that night, she sat at her small desk in her quarters. The lamp cast a soft glow over stacks of handwritten notes, old training outlines, tactical sketches, fragments of advice. One of them caught her eye. A line she'd scribbled years ago on a napkin during deployment. In chaos be still, in stillness be aware. She smiled. That was what she'd passed on. Not technique. Not fearlessness. But awareness of self, of control, of the weight of choice. She folded the paper neatly and slipped it into her journal. Outside, the night grew heavy again. The hum of generators, the distant rhythm of waves, the soft hiss of wind through the wire fences. She lay back on her bunk, eyes open, thoughts quiet. For the first time in a long time, she felt something close to peace, not because everything was resolved, but because something was continuing. Maybe that was all anyone could hope for. To set something in motion that keeps others steady long after you're gone. The ocean roared outside, endless and patient. It reminded her of Thorne, of his salute, of the day everything shifted. She whispered his name softly into the dark, a quiet thank, you sent years too late. And in that silence, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Belonging. In the months that followed, Rourke's name began to appear on reports across commands, always the same comments. Calm under pressure. Exceptional restraint. Teaches through action, not noise. And every time she read one, Sarah would smile, because that was the mark she meant to leave. Not the black star drawn on some gym floor, but the invisible one, etched quietly in the discipline of those who'd listened. The one no one could erase. The message came on a Sunday morning. A quiet day. No drills, no briefings, just wind, salt, and the rhythmic slap of waves against the pier. Sarah was halfway through her first cup of coffee when the notification blinked across her tablet. Fleet Master Chief Raymond Thorne, retired deceased, age 68. For a moment she just stared at it. The letters didn't look real. They never do when the world takes someone you thought was permanent. She set the cup down carefully, as though noise might make it truer. Outside, gulls screamed above the bay. The morning light spilled through her window, golden and merciless. She read the message again. It didn't change. There was no attached file, no condolence summary, no official notice. Just a brief line and a date. The military never wasted words on what couldn't be fixed. She leaned back slowly, her fingers tightening around the tablet until her knuckles whitened. Then quietly, she whispered the words that had once anchored her. Hold position. Her throat tightened. She closed her eyes. And for a long while she didn't move. That afternoon, she stood at the memorial service in Norfolk. Rows of uniforms lined the base chapel, crisp blues, clean whites, polished metals. The kind of ceremony the Navy does well. Order, precision, control. But beneath the order, emotion hummed like an undertone everyone felt, but no one named. The air smelled faintly of polish and flowers. The flag-draped table at the front bore Thorne's nameplate, his medals neatly arranged in perfect symmetry. Sarah stood in the back, silent, hands clasped behind her back. She didn't need to be seen. The chaplain spoke softly, his words blending faith with service, duty with memory. She barely heard them. Her eyes were fixed on the framed photo, the old man's steady eyes, the faint smirk that hinted he always knew more than he let on. She could almost hear his voice again. Leadership isn't about volume or authority. It's about respect and competence. She exhaled through her nose, slow. Those words had never left her. They had become her compass, and now, standing there, she realized how deeply they had guided everything she'd done since. The service ended with the low, haunting sound of taps. Every note felt like an echo of something larger, not just death, but gratitude, reverence, and the weight of continuity. When the last note faded, the room held its breath. Then one by one, people began to leave, soft footsteps, quiet murmurs, the shuffling of metals brushing fabric. Sarah stayed behind. She walked to the front, the echo of her boots small and respectful. The chaplain gave her a nod before leaving her alone with the flag and the photo. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she said softly, "You were right, Chief, about all of it." She stood in silence for a few beats more, then brought her hand up, not sharp, not mechanical, but slow, deliberate, heavy with meaning. Her salute hung in the air longer than it needed to. And for the first time since that day in Coronado, she felt the circle close. Thorne had saluted her to remind the world that respect had no rank. Now she returned it, to remind herself that respect had no expiration. Outside, the sky had turned gray. The first drops of rain tapped softly against the pavement. Sarah walked alone down the pier, the flag still folded in her hand. The wind smelled like memory, salt steel, and the faint ghost of the Pacific. She stopped halfway down and looked out over the churning waves. In her mind, she could still see that gym. The slap, the silence, the salute. But now it all felt different. Smaller somehow, not in meaning but in scale. Because Thorne hadn't just taught her discipline that day. He had taught her how to see. How to look at arrogance and not hate it. How to look at fear and not flinch. how to look at silence and understand that it's not emptiness, it's power. She whispered into the wind, "You didn't need to say it, Chief. I heard you anyway." The rain came harder now, soaking through her uniform. She didn't move, didn't seek shelter. She just stood there and let the ocean remind her that permanence is a myth. Everything changes, even legends fade, but the standard that remains. A week later, a package arrived at her office. No sender listed, just a return code from a storage facility in San Diego. Inside was a small wooden box, Navy issued. Inside that, a single item. Thorne's old challenge coin. Tarnished heavy, its edge worn smooth from years of being carried. On one side, the seal of the United States Navy. On the other, a single engraving she'd never seen before. A star. 5 points, etched deep and dark into the metal. She turned it over slowly, feeling the texture under her thumb. The engraving wasn't standard issue. It wasn't official. It was personal. And somehow she knew what it meant. Thorne had carried the story too. Not as gossip, not as legend, but as a reminder. The Morgan mark passed down in silence, carried in pocket, remembered in principle. She set the coin on her desk, staring at it under the light. No ceremony, no words, just that single black star, the same symbol someone had once drawn on a mat so long ago. And for the first time in years, Sarah Morgan smiled. Not the kind that hides pain, the kind that accepts it. That night, she gathered her trainees in the gym. The same group she'd been molding for months, Rourke among them, now seasoned, composed. They lined up in silence. She stood before them, eyes calm, the faint hum of rain outside echoing through the hangar. Without preamble, she said, "I want to show you something." She held up the coin. The metal glinted faintly in the light. "This belonged to a man who taught me what leadership really means," she said softly. "He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he didn't need to." Her gaze swept across the room, steady, sharp, kind. He taught through silence, through example, through the kind of respect that doesn't need an audience. No one moved. No one dared to break the spell. She continued, "If you want to honor him, don't copy me. Don't repeat stories. Live the standard, that's what matters." Her hand closed around the coin. And then she placed it gently at the center of the mat. A single gesture. No ceremony. No applause. But somehow, every person in that room felt the weight of it. The mark was reborn, not in ink but in meaning. The Morgan mark, now Thorne too. Not a story. A standard. After dismissal, when the gym was empty again, she stayed behind, kneeling beside the coin, watching the light flicker against it. She thought of how far everything had come, from the heat of Coronado to the cold wind of Virginia, and how one moment of silence had become a legacy that reached further than she ever intended. She whispered, "You did it, Chief. You were right. It never was about rank." The lights dimmed automatically as the clock hit 2200. The room fell into shadow. But even in that dimness, the small coin on the floor still caught what little light remained, glinting faintly like a star that refused to fade. Outside, the storm had passed. The air smelled clean again. A faint moon hung over the Atlantic, silver and still. Sarah walked out to the edge of the pier, the night wind cool against her face. And for a brief moment, she imagined she wasn't alone, that somewhere out there, Thorne was still watching, still patient, still proud. She raised her hand in one final salute, slow, deliberate, unwavering. The gesture was silent, but the meaning was. Sometimes the people who shape us never know they did. And sometimes they do. The waves hit the rocks below, a rhythmic applause from the sea. She smiled faintly. and whispered to the night, "Fair winds, Chief." The morning she decided to leave the Navy, the ocean was calm. Too calm. It was early spring, the kind of dawn when fog clings low and the world feels suspended between what was and what's coming next. Sarah Morgan stood at the edge of the training field, the smell of dew mixing with salt, her boots pressed into damp earth. She'd been here nearly 25 years. Long enough to see bases change, names fade, uniforms evolve. But not this, not the stillness of departure. Behind her, the barracks hummed with faint life. Younger voices. New laughter. New arrogance. New potential. The cycle she had carried forward would continue without her. That thought made her proud and a little sad. A small stack of boxes sat by the hangar door. Her life packed neatly into Navy-issued cardboard. Field manuals, folded uniforms, one photo of her team from years back, and Thorne's coin, worn smooth, edges dull, but still heavy with meaning. She ran her thumb across the engraved star. Every time she touched it, she felt the same weight. Not guilt. Responsibility. Because every generation inherits the silence of the one before it, and it's up to them to decide what to do with it. She walked toward the gym one last time. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. The air smelled of sweat and rubber and rain. New recruits were running drills inside, faces she didn't know, voices she'd never command. She paused at the doorway. For a second she thought about walking in, correcting a stance, offering advice, but she didn't. They didn't need her words anymore. They already had them, carried down in tone and discipline, whether they knew it or not. The instructor noticed her and stopped the class. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. She waved a hand lightly, "Carry on." But the young sailors stood at attention, eyes fixed on her. One of them, a woman maybe 22, eyes sharp, posture perfect, stepped forward. "Ma'am," she asked softly, "is it true? Were you the one?" Sarah met her gaze. "The one." "The Morgan mark," the recruit said, almost whispering. "They said it started here." Sarah looked down at the floor. There, faintly visible through years of wear and new polish, was the outline of a small black star. Faded, uneven. Still there. She smiled, not out of pride but memory. Then she looked back at the recruit. "They tell that story wrong," she said quietly. "It was never about a fight." The girl frowned. Then what was it about? Sarah thought for a long moment. Then, about remembering who you are when someone tries to make you forget. The room went still. No applause. No questions. Just that quiet weight truth always brings when it lands softly enough to be heard. She nodded once to the instructor, "Train them well," and turned to leave. Outside, the sunlight was breaking through the fog, gold edges cutting into gray. Rourke waited by the truck, now a lieutenant himself. He grinned when he saw her. "You sure you want to go through with this?" She smirked faintly. "You planning to stop me?" He shook his head. "Not a chance." She climbed into the passenger seat, the motion automatic after years of repetition. The base stretched behind them, hangars, docks, the endless blue horizon. They drove in silence for a while. No music. Just the sound of tires on wet pavement. After a few minutes, Rourke said, "I read the new training doctrine they're circulating. They call it the Morgan Standard now." She glanced at him. "You're kidding." "Nope, whole section on restraint and respect. They made it official." Sarah laughed, soft, genuine, surprised at how light it felt. "The Navy never changes," she said. "It just learns slowly." Rourke smiled. "You taught them patience." She looked out the window, watching the coastline roll by. "No," she said quietly. "Thorne did, I just listened." They reached the edge of the base, the guard station, the final gate. Beyond it, civilian life waited like an uncharted ocean. Rourke parked and turned to her. So what now? She thought about it. Sleep, maybe teach, but not like this. No ranks, no uniforms, just people learning to hold their ground. He nodded. I'll send updates, he said. She smiled faintly. Don't just keep doing it right. He laughed under his breath. That sounds exactly like you. She opened the door, the wind catching her hair. Fair winds, Lieutenant, she said. He saluted, crisp, formal. She returned it, soft, steady, final. Then she walked through the gate without looking back. Months passed. Virginia faded into memory. Civilian life was quieter, stranger, but she adapted the way all disciplined people do, slowly, deliberately, one morning at a time. She taught at a small, community self-defense center near the coast. No uniforms, no titles. Just people learning the same thing she'd learned long ago, how to stay calm when the world tries to shake you. Sometimes she'd watch them move, clumsy, uncertain, trying too hard, and smile. They reminded her of the sailors she'd trained, the recruits who once stared at the mark on the mat. And every so often she'd share a story. Never names. Never rank. Just lessons. One evening after class, a young woman approached her, shy, hesitant. You were in the Navy, weren't you? Sarah hesitated, then nodded. A long time ago. The girl smiled. I could tell, you move like someone who's not afraid of silence. Sarah chuckled. Silence can be loud if you listen right. The girl frowned slightly. What do you mean? Sarah's eyes softened. It's where truth lives, she said. It's where respect begins. Later that night, she sat on the beach, watching the tide roll in under a rising moon. The air was cool, the sand cold beneath her boots. Somewhere far out to sea, a ship's lights blinked against the horizon, small, distant, steady. She thought of Thorne, of Rourke, of Davis, of every person who had crossed her path and taught her something, even when they didn't mean to. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Thorne's coin. The engraved star caught the moonlight, glowing faintly. She held it for a long time, then placed it in the sand beside her. Not to bury it, just to let it rest. Because some legacies aren't meant to be carried forever. They're meant to be released into the world, into the next generation, into whatever silence follows. The waves lapped closer, the foam brushing against the coin, polishing it clean. The sea would take it eventually. That felt right. Sarah smiled. No medals. No crowd. Just the sound of water and wind, the same music that had followed her all her life. Far out on the horizon, the ship turned slowly, heading west. Its lights flickered once, as if in salute. She whispered into the dark, sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Then she stood, brushed the sand from her hands and walked away, leaving the coin glinting in the moonlight, half buried, half shining. By morning, the tide would hide it. But someone someday would find it again. Maybe a sailor. Maybe a child walking the beach. And they'd hold it, feel the weight of it, and wonder who left it there. And maybe, just maybe, they'd move through the world a little quieter. A little steadier. A little stronger,